I think it's very unlikely that Israel will be able to fight more than one front. It can't even defeat Hamas in Gaza, let alone take on Hezbollah as well. So I think it's quite unlikely that it will do that. However, there is always a fear of what we call the miscalculation, that if Israel thinks that Hezbollah will not sort of go up the escalation ladder in response to what Hezbollah would see as a very brazen or provocative strike. But I think it's been made clear now that Beirut is a red line. And of course, Hezbollah does have the power to inflict very sort of devastating damage on Israel. There is sort of mutually assured destruction between both sides.
Well, Dr. Amal Saad is a lecturer in politics at Cardiff University and an expert on Hezbollah. Good afternoon, Dr. Saad.
Hello, good afternoon.
Many people will look at the complex picture that is emerging here in the Middle East and wonder what is going on. But the key point here seems to be that Israel is blaming Hezbollah for these attacks, even though Hezbollah has denied that it is responsible. What do you think are the real risks here?
Well, obviously there are risks. It's very difficult, to predict what will happen. But I do think it's more likely that Israel will content itself with a more limited but significant strike, as it's saying. I mean, these have been messages that have been relayed through Western intermediaries, according to media that I've been following, that they want Hezbollah to sort of absorb whatever strike so as to avoid an all-out war. Of course, Hezbollah is not going to absorb a strike; it will respond. Now, the question is, what does limited mean in Israel's, understanding? If it's striking Beirut or striking civilians like a civilian target, that will obviously be crossing Hezbollah's red line, and that will most likely lead to all-out war.
Hezbollah, of course, is heavily backed by Iran, which is behind many of the disparate groups across the Middle East. Why do you think that Hezbollah has now stepped up its attacks into northern Israel, clearly at the time when Israel is already engaged in that separate conflict with Hamas in Gaza?
Well, I don't think it has anything to do with Iran sort of issuing any kind of directives to its allies, least of all Hezbollah. Hezbollah has made this very clear. It's opened a front, it's called the Solidarity Front, with the Palestinians, specifically with Hamas and Islamic Jihad, who are fighting Israel. This front aims at reducing pressure on these organizations, on the Gazans, by deflecting, sort of, or at least diverting some of Israel's attention away from Gaza. And so it has to sort of bog down fighting Hezbollah. And it's said that it will continue, this front will remain open so long as there is no ceasefire in Gaza and the aggression continues.
I mean, we're hearing some pretty strong threats from the Israeli cabinet about how Hezbollah will pay a heavy price. But of course, Hezbollah is a very powerful force in itself. And Israel presumably is really not going to want to risk another all-out war along its northern border at a time that it is still engaged in that war in Gaza.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's very unlikely that Israel will be able to fight more than one front. It can't even defeat Hamas in Gaza, let alone take on Hezbollah as well. So I think it's quite unlikely. I think it's very unlikely that Israel will be able to fight more than one front. It can't even defeat Hamas in Gaza, let alone take on Hezbollah as well. So I think it's quite unlikely that it will do that. However, there is always a fear of what we call the miscalculation, that if Israel thinks that Hezbollah will not sort of go up the escalation ladder in response to what Hezbollah would see as a very brazen or provocative strike. But I think it's been made clear now that Beirut is a red line. And of course, Hezbollah does have the power to inflict very sort of devastating damage on Israel. There is sort of mutually assured destruction between both sides.
Going to be Israel, in a sense, looking at the picture you've just outlined there and deciding that it's in its own interests only to carry out some form of limited retaliation rather than risk a wider escalation?
I mean, obviously, it is up to Israel ultimately to decide that, and Netanyahu specifically. Of course, if the US makes it very clear that it will not support Israel in any full out war on Hezbollah and on Lebanon, then that would constrain Israel much further. That would ensure that Israel has absolutely no leeway to launch such a war. So there's always that small fear that Israel might be counting on drawing in the US. But I think, the fact that Israel itself knows, as you've pointed out, that there is a very formidable foe on its border, which can, strike deep into the heart of Israel, into Tel Aviv, and destroy a lot of Israel, in fact. I think that would prevent it from doing so.
Dr. Amal Saad, a lecturer in politics at Cardiff University and an expert on Hezbollah. Really good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Let me say that we are deeply saddened by the loss of life that we saw. There is no justification for terrorism, period. And every indication is that indeed the rockets were or the rocket was from Hezbollah. We stand by Israel's right to defend its citizens from terrorist attacks.
Perhaps intervene militarily to defend Israel as it did against the...
We're in conversations with the government of Israel. And again, I emphasize its right to defend its citizens and our determination to make sure that they're able to do that. But we also don't want to see the conflict escalate. We don't want to see it spread. That has been one of our goals from day one, from October 7th on.